I went for a run on the trails at Nathan Hale Homestead in Connecticut. It's an old farmhouse from the 1700s that used to belong to a hero from the Revolutionary War. My grandmother's lake house is just a short 10-minute drive away. The tricky part was that I couldn't find a map of the trails online, and there weren't any signs at the place. It was a bit confusing because there were a bunch of mountain bike trails in the woods, but I couldn't figure out which ones to take. I planned to run about 4 miles, thinking it would take me around 30 minutes. So, I started running on the trails at Nathan Hale Homestead. It was a peaceful Monday morning around 9 a.m., and the only sounds were the distant traffic noise from Route 31, birds chirping, and the occasional rustle of squirrels or deer scampering away as I approached. The trail had a lot of twists and turns, but everything seemed normal as I jogged along. Luckily, I have pretty good directional skills, otherwise, I might have easily gotten lost. After about 20 minutes of running, something caught my eye about 50 meters away, a finely polished, light-colored wooden coffin. It was a bit uncomfortable, and I hesitated, waiting until I got closer for a better look. As I rounded a corner with some old tree stumps, my view was blocked, and when I finally reached the spot, the coffin had mysteriously disappeared. It left me feeling a bit weirded out, to say the least. That's strange indeed. Instead of the coffin, there was just a clump of ferns where it should have been. Feeling a bit uneasy, I decided to turn around and head back to my car. About halfway back, I heard a distinct knocking sound on a nearby tree. It startled me a bit, but I thought it could be a woodpecker or something like that. However, just as I convinced myself of that, not even 30 seconds later, I heard the same knocking sound on a completely different tree ahead of me. The knocking had the exact same rhythm, tock tock to tock tock. It gave me the creeps, so I picked up the pace. As the trail widened, I could see all the way to the entrance of the parking lot where my car was. Strangely, the knocking sound persisted, seemingly right next to me. I started to freak out and began sprinting back to the lot. Just as I was nearing the opening, it felt like time slowed down. Out of nowhere, it felt like the temperature dropped about 20 degrees. The birds went silent, and my basic Timex watch started acting up, beeping and glitching with the numbers on the screen. The knocking sound became incredibly loud, as if it was echoing through every tree around me, almost like it was carved into them with an axe. A wave of intense dread swept over me as I braced myself to hear the knocking rhythm again. I sprinted into the parking lot, and suddenly, everything returned to normal. The temperature was back to the mid-70s, and birds were happily chirping. When I glanced at my watch, I was startled to find it completely blank. I stood there, staring at it until it finally flashed 12 o'clock, Monday, 1:01, January 1st. The whole experience left me bewildered and a bit shaken. That's really bizarre. My watch had never reset itself like that before. I hopped into the car and turned on the engine. The clock on the radio displayed 12, which didn't make any sense. It should have been around 9:30 or 9:45 at the latest. Confused, I shifted into reverse and backed up until I reached the main road, trying to make sense of the strange turn of events. Just as I was about to shift the car into drive, I heard a sharp, rhythmic rapping on the back window, almost like someone knocking with their knuckles. It was the same beat. What made it even more chilling was that the parking lot had been empty when I finished my run, no other cars or people in sight. I didn't dare look back. Instead, I quickly sped away, making my way back to my grandmother's house. The whole experience left me with a sense of unease and confusion. I don't know why those strange things happened during my run, and even now, I still can't figure it out. I reside in a small town in rural Australia, and my life revolves around cycling. I coordinate sports events, marathons, and sell bike gear. One morning, around 6 a.m., I was driving my bike up the mountains. On the way, I noticed a woman sitting by the side of the road. Initially, I thought she might be a hitchhiker, but there were no hotels nearby, and she had no bags with her. I parked my car about 400 meters away from her, took a bottle from the car boot, and walked down to see what was happening. It struck me at that moment that she was one of the most beautiful women I had ever seen. In her 20s, with a fair complexion, long wavy blonde hair down to her hips, and the classic German hourglass figure with deep blue eyes. She was dressed in one of those long summer dresses that beachgoers adore, which seemed quite out of place in the middle of the Australian bush. As I approached her, I was simultaneously thinking, "Oh my God!" and "What the hell?" I handed her the bottle of water and asked if she was lost or needed a lift back to town. She stared at me without taking the water or blinking, making me wonder if something was off. I cautiously asked if she had run away from somewhere, and she replied with a simple "No," still not blinking. Trying to understand, I inquired if she was waiting for someone to pick her up, and again, she answered with a firm "No." When I asked about her house, she cryptically said, "Here." Considering I was halfway up a mountain with no houses around, the situation was getting creepier. I headed back to my Jeep, intending to drive down the mountain, call the cops, and have them pick up this lady. Strangely, she followed me. I tried to persuade her again, saying, "Are you absolutely sure you don't want me to take you back to town?" She maintained her refusal. Feeling uneasy about leaving her alone in the middle of nowhere, I pleaded, "I don't feel comfortable leaving you here. Please let me take you to the police station." In response, she turned around and walked into the bush, miles away from any civilization. I was left bewildered, thinking, what the actual hell? The return of bug and bird noises heightened my fear, and I started to get really scared. The absence of any other sounds while I was talking to her hit me. No magpies, no crickets, no early morning noises at all. It freaked me out, and I quickly left, making a call to the local police once I reached the bottom of the mountain. Basically, I said, "There's a woman up in the mountain who refused to get into my car," and then realized how stupid that sounded, and hung up. Whoever you are, I hope that you are okay. I spent my childhood in the countryside, right next to a national park that attracted nature lovers and bird enthusiasts. The park had rules that only allowed walking or running, but as a 10-year-old, I thought that was a silly rule. So, I would bike and ride horses there anyway because the trails were just perfect for it. I was fully aware that I wasn't supposed to ride bikes or horses in the park, and I got caught a few times. The consequences were usually just a half-hearted, "Don't do it again." But of course I did. Until one day, something scary happened that made me rethink. My family bred horses, and I often took them for rides in the park. It happened in the Forbidden Park, on the first day of summer holidays, very early in the morning. The outdoors were beautiful, with a misty and foggy atmosphere, yet a promising sunny sky. Knowing it was before 6 a.m., I figured there wouldn't be anyone on the trail to catch me. So, I let the horse go at full speed along the trail. I only slowed down when the trail got steep on one side, leading down to the river. The idea of being too close to the edge was a bit much for a kid with almost no risk assessment skills. Suddenly, the horse came to a halt and refused to take another step. Growing up with horses, I knew this usually meant you needed to investigate. Concerned about why the horse had stopped, I checked its hooves, but they seemed fine. The horse still wouldn't move, and that's when I noticed it. Someone had set a trap, a thin, sharp metal wire across the trail, perfectly at neck height for an adult. I stopped and looked around, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. The wire was tightly secured between two trees, making it impossible for me to remove. So, I led the horse around it, having to walk up a bit into the wooded area on the side of the trail. That's when I heard the singing. The song was Hey, Tantegabar, the same melody, but with different, muffled, and sniggering lyrics. Imagine Smeagol from Lord of the Rings. Today, I can only recall fragments, but roughly translated, it might have been something like, "Hey, all you runners, come here passing. Let the lifeblood pour out." Trying to be as quiet as possible with my heart pounding, I backed away, got on the horse, and hurried back the way I came as fast as I could. Realizing I needed to inform someone about the trap, I hesitated because I wanted to avoid confessing to riding a large and strictly forbidden horse on those protected trails. Now, I had a dilemma. Recollections of old tales about a possibly mad man living in the shed in the woods, an old cottage for a local hunter, came back as I clung to the horse for dear life. I made it home and shared this story with my older brother. He accompanied me back to the location. Together, we discovered the wire trap, and after some searching, we also found a spear-like pole planted in the ground right where you'd land after jumping over the fallen tree on the trail. That's when we decided to call the police. The area was thoroughly searched, and several similar traps were uncovered, but there was no sign of the old man. The subsequent summer brought significant news in the local paper. Spear-like poles were discovered just beneath the water's surface, directly below the little tower at the lake where people often dive. Additionally, black garbage bags filled with large rocks were found on the narrow bridge spanning the river. If a car had hit them, there was a real risk it could have veered off the road and into the water. I've been lucky to travel all over this amazing country, but something I saw while camping in the Georgia mountains made me think twice about the people there. I really love my home state, especially exploring the beautiful wilderness. But now, I make sure to always carry a gun when I'm out exploring. Back then, I didn't carry a gun. I went to the Blue Ridge Mountains with a friend for a week of hiking, no cell phones, just enjoying nature. We called it our unplugged week, but we did have his satellite phone for emergencies. We hiked as much as we wanted, fished, and found water. Of course, we had a GPS and a compass to make sure we didn't get lost. On our last day of hiking back, we find a small clearing in a valley with a nice pond. We decide to set up camp and fish. As night comes and our fire is getting dim, we're full from eating fish, wild onions, potatoes, and wine. We lay down to sleep, and then I hear it. My friend is already asleep, and the sound doesn't wake him. I hear something outside, nearby but not too far. A mix of fear and excitement makes me do something silly. I grab our machete, step out of the tent, holding my not-so-great weapon. The sound of drums is echoing, played with a skill that only a child with a basic sense of rhythm might have. As I step out of the tent, I see a fire on the other side of the pond. There's a woman there, but she's not making the drums sound. Instead, she's got a black kettle hanging over her fire, stirring it. When she turns to face me, I notice she must be as old as the mountains. Her clothes are just rags, but there's a strange aura about her, dark and filled with some kind of unsettling wisdom and knowledge. Her ancient eyes meet mine, and fear freezes me in place. The drumming gets louder, then stops abruptly, and she vanishes. The fire is gone, as if she and any sign of her were never there. I restart our fire but can't bring myself to sleep. When we hike out of the woods to our car, we opt to stay at a hotel in a nearby small town. I'm too exhausted from staying awake. I shared the story with my friend when he woke, and we hurriedly packed, moving as fast as our legs could go. We reached the hotel, grateful it had a restaurant and bar. I shared the tale with some locals, and they believed I had encountered the mountain witch, whose land I had unknowingly trespassed upon. The consensus was that we were only alive because I had managed to stay awake. They might have sounded like they were joking, but the locals seemed genuinely serious. Now, whenever I hike, I carry a firearm. It's mostly for my peace of mind. Whether you believe my story or not, dear listener, is up to you, but there are ancient and mysterious things in this world. Stay safe out there. While I was out geocaching, I stumbled upon a small cluster of trees in the woods adorned with Mr. Potato Head faces nailed to them. Oddly, I was about 15 kilometers away from civilization and far from any designated trail. To make things even more perplexing, when I reached out to the geocache owner, they insisted that those faces weren't part of the original setup. The land was private, and according to them, nobody else should have placed the Mr. Potato Head faces there. It remains a mystery. That sounds like a pretty strange situation. While I was hitchhiking, I decided to camp in the woods near the highway. I set up a fire, got settled in my tent, and fell asleep without any issues. However, in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing just outside my tent. I listened nervously for a while, and then there was some movement, and the sound vanished. When I woke up the next morning, I discovered a photo of my family pinned to a tree right next to my tent. It left me both disturbed and puzzled. Curiosity got the better of me, so I followed the footprints about a kilometer back into the woods until they led to a road. On the other side, there was an abandoned house. While exploring the house for anything useful, I came across several photos of people from the picture near my tent. These were individual headshots with accompanying notes apologizing for not protecting or being there for them. Feeling uneasy, I decided to leave the house, and as I stepped outside, I noticed a pickup truck on the road observing me. The driver offered me a ride back to the highway, along with some food and drink. During the ride, he shared the tragic story of the family that used to live there. The father had been in a car accident, colliding with another vehicle that carried the mother and 2 kids. Sadly, everyone in the other vehicle lost their lives, while the father survived. My brother James was on the orienteering team in high school. Orienteering is like a team adventure where they send you to a remote place in pairs. Each team gets a map and a compass. The goal is to find and reach specific checkpoints in the right order and come back as fast as possible. James and his teammates started well and found the first few checkpoints. They were doing good, but somehow they missed the next checkpoint they were supposed to reach. After realizing they missed a checkpoint, James and his teammate checked their map again. They did some calculations and realized they had made a mistake with one of the angles. As a result, they were heading almost off the edge of the map. After correcting their calculations, they set off in a new direction. It's worth noting that the wrong path they were on was never meant to be part of the orienteering course. In this unfamiliar area, James and his teammates stumbled upon what he could only describe as a crater. It was like a deep bowl in the forest, with no trees inside. Strangely, at the center of this crater, they found an old ambulance. Keep in mind, they were deep in the woods, miles away from any road, and there was this decades-old ambulance sitting in the middle of the crater. Curious teenagers that they were, James and his teammate decided to check out the old ambulance. According to my brother, nature was slowly taking the vehicle back. It was all rusted and covered in plant life. The ambulance seemed outdated, like it belonged to some era long gone, maybe the 1940s or so. As they explored, they noticed the gurney in the back was still there, but it was bent in the middle, as if something had smashed into it. There were brown smears on the walls, and it was hard to tell if it was rust, dirt, feces, or blood. The whole atmosphere gave them a terrible feeling, so they quickly decided to leave. Despite my brother's belief that he could locate it again, he flat out refuses to go back to that eerie spot in the woods. Something about it left them with an uneasy and uncomfortable vibe. When I was around 10 years old, my friend and I were walking near the river when we noticed a capsized canoe. Having been in the fairly shallow river many times before, I didn't hesitate to step in and help flip the canoe. However, as I applied pressure, the ground beneath me seemed to vanish. I was sucked into a pit, tossed around like a rag doll, and then spat out about 20 feet downstream, only to be pulled under again. This terrifying cycle repeated itself, with my friend running alongside, desperately attempting to grab hold of me. Fortunately, I was being propelled to the surface frequently enough to catch a bit of air before being pulled under again. Eventually, he reached me with a branch, and I was able to grab hold and get out of the perilous situation. We didn't try again with the canoe, and we kept quiet about what happened because we were scared of getting in trouble. A couple of days later, we found out that an elderly couple had drowned upstream. Their canoe flipped over, and the strong current did the rest. It hit me hard. I had almost been seriously hurt while trying to retrieve the same canoe that caused the tragic accident and took 2 lives. I was around 13, heading back to my grandmother's house, walking through a small section of pine trees. It was a dark and cloudy day, making it quite dim under the trees. As I walked, I spotted a kid sitting beneath a tree up ahead. This area was on the outskirts of a small town, and there were only a few kids who lived around there. Curious, I approached the young boy to get a closer look since I didn't recognize him. He seemed quite young, with his head down, appearing gaunt and skinny. His clothes were tattered, burlap or wool pants and a ragged dress shirt, both dirty and worn. In his hands he had what looked like two little tin can wagons or cars, pushing them around in the dirt. As I approached, almost right in front of him, an overwhelming sense of dread and sickness swept over me. Suddenly, I felt like I was going to throw up. "Hey," I kind of stuttered. He looked straight up at me, and I froze, feeling ice cold. In one swift motion, he grabbed his wagons, jumped to his feet, and circled around the back of the tree. It was quiet. I felt fine all of a sudden. I walked up to the tree, and he was gone. Back in the early 1980s, when I was around 8 years old, my dad decided to take me to deer camp for the first time. We were in far northern Wisconsin, where deer camp is a big deal, like a special tradition for us. When we arrived, my dad got really close to my face and shared what he called advice, but it sounded more like a warning. He told me that what happened at camp should stay at camp, and especially not to tell my mother about what I was going to witness. It was mostly a group of middle-aged guys in long johns, sharing dirty jokes and playing cards. But to my young eyes, it felt like the best place on earth. The first morning, my dad woke me up early to go hunting with his best friend, who had cancer and wasn't expecting to make it back for the next year. We were deep in the woods, in a standoff during the hunt when an unexpected thunderstorm rolled in, forcing us back to the truck. On our way back to camp, my father suddenly slams on the brakes because he sees something in the middle of the road. The rain was pouring so hard that we couldn't make out what it was from inside. So, my dad got out to take a closer look. A few minutes later, he climbs back into the truck and just says, "She's dead." We raced for miles to the nearest phone to call the police. It turns out that she was heavily pregnant, had put her car in the ditch about 5 miles away, and had died from exposure when she became lost looking for help. My main memory of this, though, is bursting into tears on the way home because I just knew I couldn't keep such a big secret from my mother. My dad simply told me that there were exceptions to every rule, and this was definitely one of them.